All right, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Existential Stoic podcast. This is episode 48, and I am Dan. I'm here with my buddy Randy, and today we have a special guest, Massimo Pigliucci. I hope I pronounced that right. And today we're going to be talking about his new book, A Field Guide. I don't know if you can see it on the camera. It's kind of hard, but A Field Guide to the Happy Life, 53 Brief Lessons for Living, where he kind of, I guess you could say, re-envisions the Enchiridion in an attempt to sort of update Stoicism. Is that accurate, I guess, depiction?
Yeah, the book has two reasons really for existing, I guess. One is I think that Epictetus needs to be better known by the general public. You know, he was a household name ever since the second century, basically, and all the way through the Middle Ages, because the Enchiridion was used by Christian monks as a training manual. It was known in the Renaissance, and in fact, it was translated by Poliziano at the Medici's court in Latin and from the Greek. And then even all the way to the 19th century. I mean, all of the American founding fathers had a copy of the Enchiridion: George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin. And then somehow during the 20th century, we kind of lost him. He's receding in the background. And I think that needs to be corrected, because Epictetus is one of the greatest philosophers ever, period, in the Western tradition, regardless of whether you're interested in Stoicism or not. So that's one reason. So how do you bring Epictetus back to the attention of a general public? Well, one way is to represent these ideas in modern language using modern examples. And that's one of the two goals of that book. The other one, however, is, as you say, bringing Stoicism itself, particularly Epictetus' version of Stoicism, but Stoicism as a philosophy, up to date with the 21st century. Because, it's a philosophy that's 2.5 millennia old almost. Yeah. And, just in the same way in which nobody is a Buddhist or a Christian today, in the way in which people were Buddhists or Christian 2 millennia ago, I don't think it makes sense to say that we should be Stoics exactly in the way, Epictetus or Seneca were. So the second notion is to bring it. Now, this is not just my project. There are other people that have been involved in sort of updating Stoicism for the 21st century. I think most importantly, Larry Baker, who just died a few years ago, his book, A New Stoicism, is arguably, in my mind at least, the best and most comprehensive attempt to update Stoicism. The problem is it's a difficult book to read. It requires quite a bit of background in philosophy. So,
well, that's always the struggle, right? Is finding that balance between, being, scholarly and having done the research and presenting an accurate picture, but also making it readable and accessible if you want to get a broader audience, which is one of the things philosophy struggles with, I think, all the time, is making it sort of, the information that it has available, which is always a problem.
But if you think about it, philosophy is not unique in that respect, right? I mean, take any field in science, and it's like, well, good luck understanding, really understanding quantum mechanics or even, in fact, evolutionary biology or molecular biology. The difference is that until recently, there were many more scientists and science popularizers who were interested in writing for the general public. But I think this has actually changed or is changing over the last decade or so in philosophy. There's a number of freelance philosophers these days, people like Julian Baggini or Nigel Warburton, who spend their entire life basically writing for the general public, and even professional philosophers that are academics have actually started paying more attention to the fact that you need to talk to the public. You can't just close yourself up in the ivory tower, so to speak, and do your thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say one thing that I really enjoyed about your book, this field guide, was that these, all of these tips were very short. They were very easy to understand, but at the same time, they were very actionable. So somebody could, it's something you could look at every day. And you could say, I can implement this today. I can work on this today. And it just seemed very down to earth and very, I felt like I could relate with you because you seem like a human being, as opposed to someone who was like very intellectual and just trying to make me understand that you knew more than me.
Thank you. That was exactly the idea. And of course, again, this is an homage to Epictetus. I mean, Epictetus reads that way. If you read the discourses or the manual, he does read them. Of course, as we know, he actually didn't write anything down. This was Arian of Nicomedia, one of his students, who actually wrote down this stuff, which kind of in part, I think, explains why Epictetus comes across as so lively, especially in the discourses, because Arian didn't write down verbatim lectures that Epictetus was doing. He wrote down dialogues with his students. So you get this notion, this feeling of dynamic. You know, it's like he's talking to his students. Sometimes he's berating his students. Sometimes he's being sarcastic with his students, and sometimes says, you know, what the hell are you guys doing? There's one of my favorite bits in the discourses where he says, you know, you guys come in here and study Stoicism, but when I meet you outside, you all behave like Aristotelians.
Taking on the task on it. Yeah, I really liked it. And I really loved, you know, I love the introductory material was enough, I think, to get people sort of going and on course to read the rest of it. I like the idea of having a handbook. I wanted to ask you, what do you think some of the biggest misconceptions people have about Stoicism coming to it that you hope to address through works like this?
Well, the big one that often comes up is this notion that Stoicism is about going through life with a stiff upper lip and suppressing emotions, basically, you know, Mr. Spock from Star Trek. And, you know, with all due respect to Spock, who's my favorite character in Star Trek, nevertheless, you don't, as a human being, you don't want to live that way. And in fact, sure enough, the Stoics don't actually say that we should live that way. As in every misconception, there is a grain of truth. You know, the word Stoic, the modern English word Stoic with a little s, does have something remotely to do with Stoicism with the capital S, meaning the philosophy. So the stiff upper lip, you know, distortion comes out of the fact that the Stoics really do put emphasis on endurance. Right. If something is happening that is outside of your control, as Epictetus would put it, then what are your choices? You either throw a tantrum, which is not a very, you know, adult thing to do. Take it. It's not like you have a choice. So in that sense, there is an emphasis on in Stoicism on endurance. But the issue of the emotion stuff there is like, no, the Stoics don't actually say that we should suppress your emotions, for one thing, because they are perfectly aware that it's not possible to suppress one's emotions. Just read Seneca's On Anger, and he's very clear about this. Like, you know, you just can't do it. Now, what you do want to do, however, is to pay attention to the fact that there are, according to the Stoics at least, two major categories of emotions. What they call the unhealthy emotions, the pathe, and the root of that word is the same as the English word pathology. So that tells you it's not something good, right? And then the eupatheiai, these are the healthy emotions. The analogy here is, I think one way to understand the difference between healthy and unhealthy emotions is to think in terms of the body and of food that nourishes the body, right? So we all know that there is healthy food, you know, broccoli, for instance, you know, steamed broccoli or something like that, right? You know, high fibers foods and stuff like that. And then there is unhealthy food, you know, French fries and, you know, stuff like that. Now, it's easier for us to go for the French fries than for the steamed broccoli, but we know that that's not good for us. If you do French fries all the time, you're not gonna live long. You're gonna have serious long-term health problems. Similarly, with the emotions, the Stoics say that it's easier to indulge our unhealthy emotions, such as anger, hatred, fear, things like that. It just comes naturally. You just go with it. Go with it. It's like, you know, it feels, even feels good, just like a meal based on junk food. It really feels good, but it's not good for you, and it's not good for other people. And so their idea is that we should try to modulate and come to terms with the unhealthy emotions as much as possible, and actively, mindfully cultivate the healthy emotions, just like you will mindfully, actively cultivate a healthy diet, right? You have to make choices. When you go to the supermarket, you're going to make a choice. You're going to stay away from the ice cream, and you're going to pick, you know, the vegetables and the fruits. And it's the same idea with the emotions. Of course, the emotions, you can't just pick them. You have to cultivate them. You have to deal with them. But it's the same basic idea. And so the notion is not that we should suppress our emotions. The notion is that we should modulate our emotional spectrum to move as far away from destructive, unhealthy emotional responses toward healthy ones. The unhealthy responses and emotional responses are actually defined very clearly by the Stoics, because sometimes people ask, so why is anger, let's say, an unhealthy emotion? Isn't it a little bit of anger a good thing? Because after all, it gives you a little bit of a more incentive to act in a certain way, to react to injustice, let's say, things like that, right? That's the Aristotelian position. And Seneca makes fun of Aristotle on anger. He says that one of Aristotle's arguments for why we should be a little bit angry, not too much, says Aristotle, but a little bit, as if you could control it. And that, in fact, that's the first thing that Seneca says, like, this guy is a fool if he thinks he can control anger. Once an anger is started, you're not going to control it. That's the Stoic definition of an unhealthy emotion. It takes over reason. And so once you let it go, there's no stopping it. There's no controlling it. It's like, it's foolish to try to control it. But Seneca says, so according to this Aristotle guy, one of the reasons anger is good is because if your soldiers, let's say, are prepared for battle and they're a little bit angry, they're more willing to go into battle. And Seneca's response is, well, that may be true, but it's also true that your soldiers will be more willing to go to battle if they are a little drunk. That doesn't mean that a drunken army is a good idea. It's just like, it doesn't work that way. So that's about the treatment of the emotions. So I think that the stiff upper lip and the emotion suppression is one of the major misconceptions about Stoicism. But there is a second one that I think is even more pernicious. Not only because it's not true, but because it kind of, if taken seriously, it kind of undermines the whole of Stoic philosophy. So there is this common misunderstanding, I would argue, among a lot of modern commentators, that Stoicism is a quietist philosophy, meaning that it's a philosophy that stays away from political and social involvement, that it's about you cultivate yourself, about self-improvement, you cultivate yourself. It's about you, basically, and not about other people, which is completely false. It's totally the opposite of what Stoicism is really supposed. That's Epicureanism, actually. Epicurus, because he thought that the highest good in life is a life without pain, either physical or mental, he actually did counsel his students not to get involved socially and politically, because social and political involvement, as we all know, is painful. It's emotionally painful, stress. Right? Yeah, it causes a lot of stress. But the Stoics were kind of the opposite. For the Stoics were cosmopolitan. They believed that every human being on earth is our brother and sister, and that we have a duty to be involved socially and politically. Seneca is very clear about this. The wise person has a duty to be involved politically as much as he can or she can. At the highest levels, if you're the president of the United States, at a local level, if you are, average Joe or Jane, but it doesn't matter. You still have a duty to be involved socially. Related to this notion of sort of Stoicism as being a quietist philosophy is this idea that, but the Stoics are about enduring whatever happens to you, right? So Epictetus says often, don't wish for things to be different, just accept and even embrace things the way they are. Well, if you take that in isolation, right? So just that little phrase, then sure, it sounds like he's saying, don't care about the rest of the world, do your thing. But you cannot take a philosophy in isolation, just one little quote at a time. And so in context, actually, what Epictetus is saying, Marcus Aurelius is even more clear about this. He's saying, you need to endure whatever you cannot change, but you have a duty to change what you can. Right, and modern critics forget the second part. Marcus Aurelius has this beautiful passage in the Meditations where he says, "Don't wait for Plato's Republic on Earth," meaning utopia, basically. Just do whatever little good you can, make whatever little difference you can make, because that's important. That does make a difference for other people. So those, I think, in my mind at least, are the two major misconceptions about Stoicism.
So you mentioned they're doing what's within your realm of control, and you talk about that in the beginning of your book. noticing what's within your control and what's not within your control. And I notice nowadays there's kind of a very marketing-based culture that we have, at least in the United States. And like the three evergreen areas that they have in there is health, wealth, and relationships, which are three things which are distinctly out of your control. So it's almost like we have a society that's addicted to the things out of their control. What's kind of a practical way that somebody who can go from this self-help type of thing to actually transitioning to what's within their control?
Yeah, that's a good question. The answer is very simple in theory. In practice, it's very difficult. That's the way it goes. And in fact, I would say that that's true not just for Stoicism, but for any other philosophy of life. Stoicism is a demanding philosophy, but so is Christianity, so is Buddhism. If you want to be a good Buddhist, it takes effort and it's a sustained effort throughout your life. So just because it's easy to understand, it doesn't mean it's easy to practice, but that's the whole point. You need to practice it. So the answer to your question is very simple as far as the Stoics are concerned. And it lies into the dichotomy of control, what's sometimes called the dichotomy of control. I actually don't like that term because control is actually the wrong term here. Because when you tell people that some things under your control and other things are not under your control, immediately somebody says, well, but there are things that are neither because I can influence them. It's like, I know. But in fact, the things that you can influence themselves turned out to be made of two components, the things under your control and the things that are not under your control. So the dichotomy still holds. But I prefer to refer to it as the Stoic fork. That's often the alternative way of putting it. And in fact, Epictetus, in some translations, doesn't use the word control. It uses the word up to us, right? So there are some things that are up to us and other things that are not up to us. In other words, some things for which you can take responsibility, the buck stops with you, and other things for which the buck doesn't stop with you. The ultimate responsibility is not yours. And you're right, Reynald, that all the externals are not up to us. Again, we can influence them. Of course, I can take care of my health. Of course, I can, work on my career, on my reputation, on my relationships, all of those things. But work here just means apply good judgment to any particular situation that concerns those externals, and then decide on a course of action. Those things, judgment and decisions to act or not to act, are in fact up to me. Nobody can say, do this or do that. I mean, they can say it, but ultimately it is my decision whether to do something or not to do something. But the outcomes of my actions and my decisions and my judgments, those are not up to me because they depend on external factors to some extent, right? So my career depends not just on my efforts, but also on my colleagues, my competition, my boss, etc. My relationship obviously doesn't depend just on me, it depends on my wife just as much. My health depends certainly in part of how much good care I take on myself and how careful I am in the middle of a pandemic. But at the same time, bodies age and viruses strike and disease happens, and there's not much you can do about it. So the simple answer to the question of so in this society where we're obsessed with outcomes, what do we do? Well, we turn exactly the other way around, and the Stoic advice there is to internalize your goals. So it comes natural to us, particularly because we live in the kind of society that we live, to focus on outcomes. So you go for a job interview and you start worrying about whether you get the job or not. You start dating somebody and you fall in love with that person and you start worrying about whether the relationship is going to work or not, whether he or she reciprocates, and so on. As you're worried about your reputation and so on and so forth. Right, but those are all outcomes. What you should be concerned with are the things that are up to you, which are your intentions and your actions, right? So in terms of my career, I should not concern myself with how well it goes. I should be concerned myself with how well I do, what my decisions are in terms of should I do this or should I do that? Should I try to change jobs? How should I do my job? Those are all internal. Those are all my decisions, right? In terms of relationships, the same idea. I shouldn't be concerned about whether the other person likes me or loves me or whatever it is. That's up to them. I should be concerned about being a loving person, somebody who is reliable, somebody who is trustworthy, and so on and so forth. And then let the chips fall as where they may, as they say. Now, this is easy to understand, as I said, difficult to practice, right? Which is why Epictetus says that every single thing you do, everyone, from the minor ones to the big ones, every day, you should always ask yourself about this, what is up to me and what is not up to me. And in fact, a couple of years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, I wrote a book with my friend Greg Lopez called A Handbook for New Stoics, which is entirely made of exercises, basically. And the very first exercise, surprise, the way we suggest people do the exercise is actually to, you can do it mentally, but it helps if you actually do it on paper, with paper and pen, or on a computer. Just draw a spreadsheet or a table with 2 columns, up to me, not up to me. And then whenever you face something, let's say a job interview, right? Start writing down as many things that you think are up to you on the left column, and as many things as you don't think are up to you on the right column. Just writing them down is very helpful because it focuses your attention on, oh, right, that's right, there's this that is up to me, there's this, and so on. And then what you need to do is you go back to that list, and on the one hand, you focus your attention on the left side of the list, things that are up to you, because that's where your agency actually is efficacious. And on the things about on the right side, you repeat to yourself some kind of mantra that says, this is not up to me. I'm okay, whatever things happen. So for instance, let's take the example of a job interview, right? What is up to me? Putting up the best resume possible for the job, preparing for the job interview in the best way I can, showing up for the job interview on time, being properly dressed for the job interview, not going out with my buddies and drink the night before, because that interferes with my sleep pattern and therefore with my performance. What is not up to me? The outcome of the interview. Whether the other guy, the guys who are interviewing me, likes me or not. Whether I actually do fit the job in reality as opposed to what I think I do. What the competition is. All of those things are not up to me, right? And so you approach things very deliberately that way. And initially it's difficult because it's natural to get focused on the outcome. But the more you do it day by day, even with very small things, in your day-to-day life, and then working out to the big ones, then it kind of becomes ingrained, becomes a second nature.
Yeah, I really like that idea too, because I think it just puts so much. I think when we focus on the things that are out of our control too, we end up just really not doing things to make it better or to improve the outcome, because we get focused, we get distracted by things, and it just sets us off course. I wanted to actually, if I could ask you a question about our relationship to externals, because one of the things you mentioned in I think it was theme 1 in the updates, was this idea that externals don't need to be despised. And you've given it, you suggest sort of ranking, putting virtue on top, and then ranking, these things, and recognizing that some things are still good. We can seek them, I guess, to a certain extent. And we just remember that virtue is the only thing of value. Do you think that, I think updating it makes a lot of sense, and I really like this idea. I was just curious if you think that there is the risk that, if, say a Lamborghini or something, because I think you use that in the example,
right? If
that's one of the goods that I recognize, is pursuing that, or even getting it, is that getting in the way of virtue in some way, do you think, or is it, how do you handle that sort of question?
No, that's a very good question. So first of all, let me give a little bit of background about the despising stuff. So both Epictetus and especially Seneca use often the words to the effect that you should despise externals, things like that. But in fact, that's really not the Stoic position. Even if you go back to the early Stoics, Zeno and Chrysippus, those externals are not to be either despised or loved. That's why they're called preferred indifference, right? Or dispreferred indifference. They are indifferent, meaning that they don't affect your virtue, right? So having a Lamborghini or not having a Lamborghini doesn't make me a better person, right? Or a worse person for that matter. It's morally neutral. That's the meaning of the word indifferent there. It's indifferent not in the sense you don't care or you don't give a damn. It's indifferent in the sense that, okay, so if you have money or you don't have money in your bank account, that doesn't make you a better person or a worse person. What makes you a good person or a bad person is how you use that money, So it kind of the other way around, right? It comes from within. It doesn't depend on the external. Now, let me go back, however, to your question about the Lamborghini, and it does it get in your way. I would argue it does. And in fact, even Seneca clearly argues that it does. He didn't know anything about Lamborghinis, but he knew a thing or two about wealth. He was actually a wealthy person, a very wealthy person. So here's the notion. Technically, it doesn't matter as far as Stoicism is concerned, how much money you have or how many goods, material goods you have, so long as you did not acquire those goods or that wealth in an unvirtuous way, like exploiting people or something like that, and B, you don't use those goods or wealth in order to oppress people, right? So long as, in other words, so long as you act virtuously, it doesn't matter whether you are the poorest person in the world or the richest person in the world. However, Seneca, good psychologist that he was, says, yeah, that's in theory. In practice, the more stuff you have, the more money you have, the more wealth you have, the more you're tempted to use it, incorrectly. And so you risk undermining your own virtue. He says, if you were a sage, the ideal Stoic practitioner, right? That you always make right decisions, virtuous decisions, then it doesn't matter. I guess a sage could be a billionaire. It doesn't really matter because the sage always makes the right decision. But unfortunately, most of us are not sages. And so we kind of undermine ourselves that way. Let me give you an analogy. This is actually something that there is pretty good evidence in modern psychology that Seneca was onto something here. So modern psychologists will tell you that if you have a problem with some kind of temptation, let's say, you're a little bit overweight or your health is not exactly where it should be, and therefore you should avoid certain kinds of foods, right? Let's say ice cream for one thing. Well, the best way to avoid ice cream is to skip the ice cream aisle at the supermarket entirely, just bypass it, right? Say, oh, it says conveniently, it says ice cream over there. So you just say, okay, I'm gonna go somewhere else, and not buying the ice cream at all, as opposed to buying the ice cream, putting it into the freezer, and then telling yourself, oh, I'm not gonna eat it that much. I'm just gonna go in there just a little bit once in a while. I'm gonna treat myself. No, you won't, because now you have a constant lure into your freezer, right? That thing is calling to you constantly. And so you have to use your willpower every minute of your day that you're at home to resist the thing. If, on the other hand, you use your willpower once, say, no, I'm not going to buy it, then you don't have a problem. Because now if you feel the urge for an ice cream in the middle of the night, you can't just get up and go to the refrigerator and open it. You have to actually get dressed, go downstairs, go around the corner. That's a lot of work, right? And the more work you put between you and something you want to stay away from, the more likely you are to stay away from it. The same goes with wealth, possessions, and virtue, right? If you say no to extravagance, to luxury, and a Lamborghini would definitely qualify as luxury, right?
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong in having a car if you need it. I don't have a car, for instance. I live in New York City, and I have not owned a car since 2006, which is when I moved here. And that's because I don't need it. It's superfluous. I take the subway and walk around all around. But of course, I've also lived in places where you could simply not live without a car. You couldn't get around. Yeah. You couldn't get grocery shopping, without a car. Yeah. So it's fine to have a car that's an external possession, and it's fine even to have a car that you like. I mean, there's no reason to go for the lowest rung possible.
Yeah.
But there is a fine line, and I think we all know deep inside where that fine line is between something that is comfortable and you can afford easily and you can, deal with and all that, and then moving across that line and going into luxury. Seneca says, once you cross that line into luxury, there is no stopping point, right? So if you, for instance, say, okay, I'm going to buy a certain number of pairs of shoes that are enough for me to walk and have a sufficient variety. You don't want to use only one pair of shoes because that might not go for every occasion or for every type of weather and everything. But what do you need? 3, 4, 5, fine. Once you start aiming into the 15, 20, 100, then there is no stopping point, right? Because now you've gone so far beyond what you actually need that every time you see a pair of shoes that you like, you're just going to buy it, right? That now you stepped into luxury. And even though the luxury itself doesn't undermine your virtue, it makes it more difficult to practice virtue, because now you are, in fact, as you were saying a minute ago, Daniel, you are distracted. Now your focus is not on improving yourself and making yourself a better person. Now your focus is on, hey, I should get the latest model of iPhone, or hey, I should get, for instance, in terms of, smartphones, for years now, my policy has been, I wait until the new model comes in and I buy last year's model, which has the practical consequence that I save a lot of money, for one thing, because once the new model is out, the old model is cheap. They just sell it for cheap. It is still a really, really good piece of technology, because it's only a year old. It's not like I'm getting something ancient. But at the same time, it's a way for me to moderate myself. It's like, do I really need the latest model? No. Why? It's a phone. It works perfectly fine. It does everything that I want, and so I don't need to go with the latest model, spend more money, and so on and so on and so forth. So I can, instead of obsessing about, competing with my friends about, hey, I got the latest camera, the latest blah blah blah. I said, I don't care. I just got this thing because it works.
I really like that too, because I think so many people struggle with that, especially in the society with the, with consumerism and stuff, and always wanting the next thing. Sorry, did you want to jump in, Randy?
Well, on the same line, so we kind of play games with consumerism, like I have better than you have. And you mentioned in the book how the only games worth playing are games that you can win. And one of the best games you can win is living a better life. So I was wondering, from your own personal life, do you have any practices or any advice, more than you've given us already about the phones, for things that have actually helped you kind of pursue a better life?
Yeah, there's a number of exercises that I do on a regular basis. As I said a few minutes ago, I co-wrote a book that has actually 52 exercises, and not that we suggest necessarily with Greg that people should do all 52 of them. Although when we were writing the book, we actually went through each exercise and tried it out. And these exercises are all called from the ancient sources. They're all based on Epictetus, Seneca, Musonius Rufus, and Marcus Aurelius. Mostly, those are the four big ones. But they're also updated to modern science. I mean, I am a scientist as well as a philosopher, so I like to think for things to be evidence-based, as they say. Right? So we checked with modern psychology, psychological literature, and saying, does this thing actually work? Does it actually? Is there evidence? Is there reason to think that this thing works? But of course, out of the 52, I am my preferred ones, and I have a smaller set of exercises that I do on a regular basis. One is the one that I mentioned a few minutes ago, the dichotomy of control. Which I do either in writing, as I explained it, or just mentally. Sometimes now I've been doing it for so long that it's just mental. It's like, okay, what is under my control? What is not under my control?
I like that.
For instance, let me give you an example. In the middle of the pandemic, early on in the pandemic, my wife and I were living here in Brooklyn, and all of a sudden the refrigerator breaks down. Not good, because that meant that we had to go out grocery shopping every day, which is obviously increased the chances of exposure to the virus. And this was before the vaccines were out. Also, you can't buy produce, fruits and stuff like that. So you tend immediately to eat stuff that is less actually healthy for you, right? So canned foods and stuff like that. So I still remember this very clearly. We just looked at each other as soon as we found out that the refrigerator was not working. And the first thing that came out of our mouth was, okay, so what is up to us here? Right? And we made a list of things. So the first thing is we called the management company of the building, and we said, can we get a new refrigerator delivered? And they said, no, we don't allow, at this moment, we don't allow delivery of large appliances. Okay. Well, do you allow delivery of small things? Yes, we do. Great. So we did some research on the internet, and we found a good, dorm type refrigerator now, which was delivered 2 days later. Now, that's not ideal, but at least it does still allow you to get some fresh fruit and produce and put it there for a few days. And then, of course, we also switched our priorities in terms of grocery shopping. We went for foods that are less perishable, that sort of stuff. So that was it. Instead of getting upset about, damn, we are in the middle of a pandemic and now the refrigerator breaks down, it's like, what good does that do, right? So the first thing is the dichotomy control. But some of my other favorite exercises include, some of them are about consumerism. One of them is based on this story that is sometimes told about Socrates, that he was going through the Agora, the Athenian marketplace, right, in the middle of the city, where there were all sorts of things for sale. And he was walking by with his friends, and he went through the entire thing from one end to the other. And then he told his friends, I didn't realize there were so many things I didn't need. So he didn't buy a single thing. It's like, so that inspired a exercise that can be done in a couple of ways, an anti-consumerism exercise that can be done in a couple of ways. One of them is, I call it the walk through the mall. So pick a shopping mall, very deliberately and very slowly go through all or most of the outlets, take a look at all the merchandise, don't buy anything, of course. Get to the other side and tell yourself exactly what Socrates said. It's like, I didn't know there were so many things that I didn't need. Now, I have to do this almost every time I travel, because I don't know if you noticed, but airports lately are built in this way that you have to, especially international airports, you have to go through, a bunch of shops before you can actually get to your gate. And it's like, so I do it deliberately. I just slow down, I look at things, and I get to the other side. It's like, look at me, I haven't bought anything. The other way to do it is for people that shop online. You decide, you mark your calendar on Monday morning, you say, okay, for this entire week, I'm not buying anything at all, except for foods and basic necessities, stuff like that. Just nothing. See if you can do it for a week. And it feels so empowering, because by the end of the week, it's like, wow. First of all, again, you save money. And second of all, you are beginning to react against this insane idea that is typically American, called retail therapy. Right? This notion that if you feel down, you feel depressed or anxious, or things are not going well, just go out and shop. That will make you feel better. It's like, what? That's the equivalent of, you feel bad, therefore go out and get some junk food, which people do. A lot of the reason, they call it comfort food, because it makes you feel better. Yeah, I know, but it also ruins your liver and your blood pressure and your cholesterol and all that other stuff. So that's one other exercise that I do on a regular basis. A good one also to do is something that is inspired by Marcus Aurelius' meditations, and is sometimes referred to as the sunrise meditation. And this actually predates the Stoics. It goes back to the Pythagoreans of the 6th century BCE. In fact, Marcus tells us that we should do as the Pythagoreans used to do. And that is, at least once in a while, set up your alarm clock a little before sunrise, get out, get a cup of coffee if you need to, then get out and go to a spot where you can see the sunrise. Now in the city here in New York, it's not that easy, but you can do it. And just stay there. Just wait until the sun rises, and then look at the spectacle of the sun rising. Of course, do not look at the sun straight, obviously. That should go without saying, but just in case. Now, why would you want to do that? Because especially, the majority of the world population at this point lives in cities. And people that live in city have rare opportunities to commune with nature, to remind themselves that we are, in fact, a part of a larger cosmos. As the astronomer Carl Sagan used to say, we're literally stardust, right? The molecules that make up our bodies were actually forged inside a supernova that exploded billions of years ago in the vicinities of the solar system. And now, how is that going to make any difference to your day-to-day life? Well, because it gives you a perspective on your problems. If you spend like half an hour looking at a sunrise, or if you can't get a sunrise, go to a sunset, right? You have reminded yourself that there are bigger things out there, that these things, there are astronomical phenomena that have been going on for literally billions of years, and that your particular problems, issues, or whatever they are, certainly they are important to you, and certainly you need to take care of them. There's no question about it. But in the big scheme of things, they're not really that important. And so it helps putting things in perspective. This notion, sometimes a similar meditation is called the view from above, right? And again, this comes from Marcus, where he tells himself like, oh, so you're having this problem. Do you imagine that nobody else in the history of humanity had this problem, right? Now, what would you want to remind yourself that other people have had the same problems? Because that way it kind of demystifies the problem, right? I mean, there's a reason why, for instance, in the middle of the pandemic, some of the best-selling books, other than, by the way, Marcus Aurelius' Meditations that shot up into best-selling territory during the pandemic. But other than those, you have Albert Camus' The Plague, Philip Roth, Nemesis, Boccaccio's Decameron. What are these? What do these things have in common? They're all about plagues, right? They're all about surviving in the middle of a pandemic. And so now you might say, well, why people, they live in a pandemic, why the hell do they want to read about a pandemic? Well, because you remind yourself that other people from time immemorable have been living through these kind of situations, and many of them actually got through them, so they are inspiration. It kind of normalizes the situation. It kind of says, this is not the end of the world. It's an unpleasant situation. It can be more than unpleasant for some people, of course. It can be deadly for some people, for that matter. But this kind of thing has been going on before, and it will happen again. And so we just need to accept that one of the things that is outside of our control is whether there is a pandemic or not. But what it is under our control is how you act in the middle of a pandemic. How do you deal with the situation? That's very much up to you.
I like those a lot. Those are really interesting and helpful. I really like the last one too, because I think it's nice. It kind of reminds you too that, it's just like looking at other people as an example too. It's reminding yourself that other people have done it. You can also do it. And that your experience is not so unique, because we love to tell ourselves that all the time.
Exactly. Oh, it's never happened to anybody. It's like, yes, it has.
Yeah.
It's almost nothing that is going to happen to you that it hasn't happened to somebody else.
That's a good one. I like that. Did you have another one, Randy?
I figured we were going back and forth, but
okay, yeah. I guess one of my other ones was just in general, like, I think this idea of updating philosophies is really crucial, because I think there's this tendency to kind of think of things as stuck, or as, the original as being somehow like perfect and that we can't change it. I think you need, obviously it needs to adapt to times. You point out at one point, that we've made moral progress. We think differently, and that we shouldn't, necessarily read this the same way. In your mind, how do you envision sort of a redo or an update of Stoicism as not deviating too far? Do you see a point of which they might go too far, or do you think that is there something core to it that's necessary that needs to stay? I was just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And I think the same question applies to other philosophies or religion, right? So as I said, nobody's a Christian today as they were 2,000 years ago. But at the same time, if you don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God and, all that sort of stuff, then why would you call yourself a Christian, right? Go someone else. I think the same goes for Stoics. Yes, there are things that can be tweaked, and some of them are more than just tweaks. Some of them might be significant changes and updates. But at the same time, if you reject the notion of a dichotomy of control, for instance, or if you reject the notion that the most important thing in life is to work on your virtue and becoming a better person, or if you reject the notion of cosmopolitanism, then why bother calling yourself a Stoic, right? Then fine. But there is no sharp line, I think. And in fact, the ancient Stoics themselves knew it. First of all, we have evidence from commentators on the Stoics, for instance, Diogenes Laertius, that the ancient Stoics themselves disagreed about all sorts of things. Cleanthes, the second head of the Stoa, had disagreements with Zeno, the first head. Chrysippus, the third head of the Stoa, had disagreement with both Cleanthes and Zeno. Posidonius, one of the middle Stoics, had disagreement with Chrysippus, Cleanthes, and Zeno. So it's like, this was going on from the beginning. It was never meant to be set in stone. Not only that, but we actually have an explicit point by Seneca in one of the letters to Lucilius. He says, remember, my friend, that the people that preceded us are not our masters. They're just our teachers. And if we find new ways to do things and better ways to do things, we ought to do things better. We don't have, and it continues, it says, we do not have a monopoly on the truth. New generations will discover new truths, and it will be okay to follow, good, in fact, not just okay, but good to follow new truths. So this is right built into Stoicism from the beginning. In my mind, that's one of the things that differentiates religions from philosophies. Right? Yeah. Now, even though religions themselves do change over time, they change not by design, but by necessity. Right. Yeah. Because you have sacred scriptures, right? If you disagree with the Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, or whatever sacred scripture, you're in trouble because you're literally disagreeing with the word of God. And God is supposed to be infallible, so there you are, there you have it. But if I disagree with Epictetus or Seneca, nobody's going to excommunicate me. It's not like I'm going to hell because I disagree with Epictetus. Epictetus was a man, brilliant man. I think he was as close to sagehood as one might possibly get. But nevertheless, he was a human being who was in part, of course, inevitably the product of his own culture, right? And so, for instance, let me give you a specific example, which is one of those that I discuss in the Field Guide to a Happy Life. So on the one hand, Epictetus in particular and the Stoics in general were ahead of their time in terms of treatment of women. Epictetus, Musonius Rufus, who was Epictetus's teacher, Seneca, Zeno, all explicitly say that women have the same exact moral abilities and intellectual abilities that men, and therefore they ought to be taught philosophy, they ought to practice philosophy. That for the time was a fairly unusual position. It was not unique, to be fair to the Epicureans. Epicureans also were friendly to women, but it was still very unusual. It was way ahead of their time. But at the same time, you find Epictetus telling his students not to be feminine if they don't do the right thing. Or Seneca says, don't behave like a woman, in the thralls of your emotions, that sort of stuff. Now, that language is the result of the fact that these people were ancient Romans, right? You just couldn't avoid it. And that was the culture of the time. So it makes no sense to me, some people, going back like 2,000 years and say, oh, look at that, they were sexist because they were, well, you're using modern standards, projecting them back 2,000 years. That makes no sense. What you need to do, the proper way, I think, of looking at what people from other eras or from other cultures have done or written is to pick the best of what they've done and give them credit for that and ignore the worst, or because the worst is the part that, why would you focus on the worst? I mean, the worst is part of what they were doing at the time. This was like background, the cultural background of the time. And, one thing that slightly annoys me when I hear people say, oh, but Epictetus was sexist or something like that. It's like, dude, just be careful, because you seem to think that we reached the pinnacle of human morality, right? That's it. We're the sages, and then we can actually criticize anybody else. It's not like that. Just wait 300 or 400 years or 500 years or 1,000 years and see what people will say about you and what you've wrote. If, of course, you're going to be lucky enough that people are actually going to bother, talking about you 500 years down the road, which most likely they won't. So, slow down. A little bit of humility here is in order. Just pick the best of what people have been writing and saying across cultures and across times. Why would you want to pick the worst? Yeah. What is the point of that, other than indulging in this exercise of superiority, which I think is fundamentally misguided and very unwise, among other things.
So I'm actually curious, looking at it from another way, if an ancient Stoic was to come to life nowadays, what do you think their perceptions of our world would be? Or what would they say that we need to focus on?
That's a good question. So obviously they will be bewildered by our technology, right? I mean, you give a smartphone to Seneca and you say, what the hell are you guys doing? What is this thing? But other than that, I don't think that would be very surprised. I mean, one of the reasons that Stoicism and other ancient philosophies like Buddhism are still practiced today and they're still relevant today is because we haven't changed that much. yes, our technology has changed dramatically, but we as human beings, we still want the same things. We still dislike the same things. We still go after or try to avoid the same kind of things. I mean, if you read Seneca, sometimes he's just comes across as your neighbor, because like there is a letter to Lucilius where he complains about the noise coming from the street downstairs, and he can't write, he can't focus because there's a lot of noise in the streets of Rome. And I say, yeah, that's right. That's what happens outside my window in the streets of New York. It's the same thing. So they would not be surprised at all to see that many people are still pursuing externals, thinking that that's where happiness comes from. They wouldn't be surprised by knowing that we still have war and famine and poverty and all that. Those are the same problems that they were talking about 2,000 years ago. I assume they would be a little disappointed by the fact that humanity hasn't made much progress, but that's outside of their control. So it is what it is.
That's great.
I like that too, though, because it also it humanizes them too. It makes them relatable in a way that we can understand, because it's, we all are dealing with the same problems and have been. Situations and circumstances might change somewhat, but it's still there. And I think that's why they're also still relevant. So relevant, right? Is that, and like you said, I like that of picking out the good things. That's what matters. Do you want to add anything? But I think we're almost out of time, but I kind of like that point as an ending point, because that's a really good one to go check out the book and read it. Well, thank you for joining us. It's a field guide to a happy life, 53 brief lessons for living. I can highly recommend it. I think Randy can as well. Thank you for joining us, Massimo. We really appreciate it. We'll be back later with another episode.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.